So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests, and when people send them in, I'll answer listener questions. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons receive perks like the monthly breaking down all the numbies, which is my dumb word for numbers sometimes I like to use. Breaking down the numbers of writing progress month to month, which almost always entails some reading recommendations related to the genre of the book, and a little bit of text at the end because I can't help myself, like a little blog post kind of thing, letting you know what's going on behind the scenes in some ways that I don't always share in the podcast proper. If you're not a patron already, you can check out all the other perks and exclusive content over at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. If you're listening to this recording, that means New Edge Sword and Sorcery Issue 0 is out now. Links to purchase the magazine in EPUB/PDF, which is free, by the way, softcover and hardcover, both at cost. So $4 American for the softcover, $12 American for the hardcover. Cheap, folks. The links to all of that are found at newedgeswordandsorcery.com, as well as in the show notes for this very podcast episode. If you haven't seen me talking about this lately on social media or in other places where I've been doing promotion for the magazine, you might wonder what the hell I'm talking about. Well, New Edge Sword and Sorcery is a brand new sword and sorcery short fiction magazine that also contains non-fiction, including long-form interviews like the ones I do on this podcast, and articles on all kinds of aspects of the past, present, and future of the genre. Even a book review, hey, why not? I am the editor of the magazine, so the captain of the ship, the director of the film, maybe more the producer of the film, but anyway, you get the idea. And I'm going to do a special episode where I will talk you through the whole story of me and the magazine and what's going on with all that next time. Before doing the big behind the scenes episode, I thought it might be interesting for you all to get to hear the voices of the authors behind the 6 original stories you'll find in the magazine. These 6 mini interviews were recorded completely out of order across many weeks in which I was producing the magazine. I did my best to keep them spoiler-free while still making them kind of enticing and actually saying something. I hope you'll enjoy them. You do not have to have read the magazine to get something from them. In fact, I hope they'll inspire people who haven't read it to go out and give it a whirl. But if you have read the magazine, you'll probably get that little bit much more out of the experience. Hey, why don't we go over and start with Bryn Hammond. Bryn is a scholar and writer of historical fiction on Mongol cultures, amongst other things, but that's kind of her main jam. She's down in Australia, and I know her from the Whetstone Tavern, naturally. A lovely woman and a talented writer. Let's go have a word with her, and then we'll quickly move through our other 5 wonderful authors. And here I am with Bryn Hammond. Hello, Bryn.
Hello, Oliver.
Lovely to have you here. Thank you for seeing me a little bit after probably your breakfast. Hello, time zones.
Happy to be here. Just after my walk.
So, 2 questions. Not the longest interview. First one is, so I really loved your story, The Grief Note of Vultures. Could you share with listeners what made you excited to tell that story? Was there like an image that popped into your head? Was there a piece of your research? You know, because I know you're quite a scholar of steppe cultures. What was it that made you go, ooh, this is it?
The crucial piece of the story came from my research and was sitting in my odds and ends of historical stories, because I've been writing historical fiction for 19 years now.
Mm.
And it was sitting there. I've wanted to write about it for years, and this was an opportunity. A sword and sorcery story meant I can use a weird element to tell that story, and it's probably better that way rather than trying to make it a strictly historical story.
What made it better to have a fantastic element in the story?
It's as though you're using imagery, or you're writing in a metaphorical mode, and it makes it punchier. You can say the same thing, but it's punchier. It's more visceral. But if every element of the story is fairly historical, it's at the historical end of sword and sorcery. And every piece of the story I did scavenge from my research on steppe cultures.
So the Tangut, I know nothing of them, and I gather that their culture in particular flowed into this tale. Is there anything you'd like to share with us about that? Did I even pronounce that right?
Yeah, my historical novels about the Mongols and the life of Chinggis Khan. And Tangut was the first state and the last state that Chinggis himself made war in once he left the steppe. It's part of North China.
Oh, okay. So what element of Tangut culture came through in your tale? What was it that sort of got woven in here? Was it to do with the spirit element that fed into the fantastic, or?
I don't have an answer to that one.
That's okay. What would you like to share, if anything else?
Maybe I'll go back and talk about the monsters.
Oh, yes, please.
When I conceived of a weird element in my story, my first thought was that the monsters are not going to be the evil of the tale. My hero isn't going to slay the monster for the safety of society, much as I love Beowulf, who does exactly that. Because she's an SNS outsider hero.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been on the side of monsters since I was a kid, and my writing is always going to elicit sympathy for monsters. So the first thing I did was have a think about who does the bad things and why, and where the real evil is in the story. And that's more likely to be in the state and its engines than in the monsters.
You make me think of the Arbiter statue in the temple, if I remember correctly, or the one who reminded your hero of the Arbiters.
Yep. The local magistrate that she herself has faced.
Right, magistrate, pardon me. Oh, neat. I like that take, and it's a very interesting one. It's that I'm sure, everything's been done before, blah, 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 but I personally, off the top of my head, don't have a memory of encountering that very much in Sword and Sorcery. It does tend to hew towards, oh, there's a monster, let's kill it. I like that.
Yeah, I want it to be a bit different than that.
And your character is an outsider, it's true. For those who haven't read the story, what made them an outsider?
She's a nomad, and she's despised in her society, as nomads have been despised by settled people.
Mm-hmm.
And settled peoples write history, and my historical fiction has always been resistant to our received histories. I want to write it from the nomad's point of view. And in this story, I get to do that. I get to leave behind affairs of state and look at a state from the underside. In Sword and Sorcery, the figure of the barbarian has been from the beginning a commentary on civilizations, states and cities. And so I took a nomad and following that classic SNS tradition.
Yeah, I mean, following that tradition, she challenges civilization by being someone who can survive quite comfortably outside of it. It's her wisdom that the civilized people in the story are dependent on. I really liked that when I was reading through an early draft. It grabbed me right away. Definitely made it clear to us why we're following her, for example, and her importance and the dependence they have on her. And then, as you say, meanwhile, there's the elements of, there's monsters, but what about the state? that crop up in more than a few places. No, I really like that. It was a big part of what made me think, I'm really glad I asked Bryn to be in the magazine. Yeah, no, wonderful story. Well, let's not give away too much because, of course, it's a short story. We could give it all away if we're not careful. But, listener, I hope you will check it out along with all the other lovely stories in the magazine. Meanwhile, the other thing I'd love to chat with you about just for a minute, Bryn, and your answer can be very short if that's all it requires. New Edge, Sword and Sorcery. Now, as with so many involved with the magazine, you are a Whetstone Tavern regular.
Yeah.
And that's how I met you. I got to find out about you and your writing and everything. And you were there for those early rugby scrum conversations back in the bloody spring of 2020. Figuring it all out and eventually getting to the idea of the magazine, I think by June. And I was really delighted when I reached out to you, in direct messages and said, "Oh, do you think you might want to do a story for the very first issue?" And you went, "I've already started working on one." That made me feel so validated. It was so nice. I'm curious, what do you mind sharing with listeners what it was that made you feel that passionate to have already thought, "Oh, I got an idea," and be thinking about writing a story and hoping I'd ask? I mean, that was so nice.
I am excited by your idea of having more outsider points of view. It's always been a strength of Sword and Sorcery, and SNS has over and over reinvented itself as to who can qualify to be our outsider hero. In New Age, I look forward to more of that, more points of view, different perspectives on society, civilization, states and cities. And being a queer woman has most certainly fed into my liking for an outsider hero, even when these are written by straight blokes. And of course, I want queer writers to flock to SNS and give us heroes that expand the ways we think. Sword and Sorcery's low stakes and private adventures feel more true to my experience as an outsider, rather than winning a kingdom or joining the forces of law and order in the end. And everybody for whom that is so, I want to read their tales. And I want them to be encouraged to join in. And I was excited to join in myself.
Well, I'm so glad you did, Bryn. I really enjoyed working with you through the editing process. If there are any editors listening, please commission a story from Bryn. Yeah, no, I'm so happy to have you with us. Well, thank you for your answers, Bryn. This has been really lovely. Is there anything else you want to add before I move on to the next writer?
No, if that's enough.
That's plenty. All right. Thank you ever so much. And that was Bryn Hammond. Okay, now we're going to hop all the way up from Australia to Northern Ireland to speak to Remco van Straten and Angeline B. Adams. They have been on the podcast before. In fact, they were my very first interview when they were promoting their book, The Red Man and Other Tales. All right, here we go. And here we are with Angeline and Remco. Hello, you two.
Hello.
Hiya.
Good to have you here. Returning champions, like so many working on the magazine. All right, first up, let's get into the story. What was it that got you excited to tell it? What was maybe an idea that carried you through the writing? Just, give us a bit about that.
Well, for years now, we've been telling stories about a trio of con artists in a world not made for them. Now, Sword and Sorcery offers a place where your characters aren't limited to success on society's terms. They can be transgressive and they can be subversive. And our characters subvert a lot of expectations about gender and disability. And we get to play with moral ambiguities as well. But because we've always had this big theme of how outsiders look out for each other, for this story, we wanted to look at it from a different angle. We wanted to explore the idea of lone survival in a hostile world. And although we write with a very new age sensibility, we really wanted to imbue it with all the darkness and grit that come from the very core of Sword and Sorcery, going back to the pulp era.
For us, what was also important is that when people say that Sword and Sorcery is only meant to be escapism, the old introduction from the Lancer Conans, in these stories, don't look for any hidden meaning or philosophies, that's old sawhorse. So we don't really think that works for us. We don't really think that there should be a distrust of emotional content in Sword and Sorcery. So it's not wrong to have some bigger truths and, put yourself in the stories as well. And, our story is a reflection of our own world. There are bits of our backgrounds, our worries, our experience. And in a postmodernist twist, there's also a little bit about our own developing views on writing and, even on New Age Sword and Sorcery itself.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And this is right at the top of the first page, so I don't think it's spoilery, but I'll cut this if you want me to. I really enjoyed that your tale has a tale within the tale being read by the characters right at the beginning. And there's a wonderful illustration. Listeners, you should go get the magazine if you haven't already, so you can check it out, by Remco, of Barsk. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah,
Barsk?
It is, I can't even remember, Bersk.
Bersk the Barbarian. And I love him. I love your characters from the Red Man and others, of course, but there's this horrible little part of me that's just like, what's Bersk up to? What's he got thinking about? What's he going to be doing next? Maybe if we get to do issues 1 and 2, we can. Who knows?
I'm sure he will return on at one time or another. Yeah, we went for that character. We wanted to introduce sword and sorcery within our universe. And for that, we had to go a couple of steps back in time and looked at Beowulf and that kind of thing. And Bersk, originally we wrote it with an E, and we thought, it's much more sword and sorcery to make it an A with a, what do you call it?
Is it an umlaut?
Umlaut, yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I love how also extremely true to sword and sorcery, again, page 1, I don't think it's too spoilery. Immediately, the people consuming the story disagree. So it felt very on point, and I loved it. And the other thing I'll say about that before we move on, I loved Bersk. I loved the sort of mini role within the greater tale his tale played and all that stuff. But I also thought you had a really deft hand at having fun with that and having fun with what you could say with that within the greater tale. But it never felt like cheap satire or taking the piss out of people who like sword and sorcery, which, you go back to the late 80s, early 90s sort of period where there was a lot of not entirely undeserved mockery of the sort of late end, sort of less creatively out there sword and sorcery that was happening, all the clonans. And it's like I read that stuff and I kind of go, okay, I get it. But after a while, you sort of think, well, make some suggestions, do something new. Don't just go, this is dumb over and over. And that's what one of many, many, many things, listener, that I really liked about your tale was that you did it with so much more sophistication and fun and good naturedness, I felt. You were sort of little ribbing at sword and sorcery while enjoying telling a great sword and sorcery tale. So thank you both for that. I felt very privileged to read the early draft, and I love what we all worked together on. Though you're the writers, I'm not credited. Let's make that clear. For what's there for listeners to become readers of, if they haven't already. So thank you for that background on the story. Now, I kind of guessed from chatting with you both online that you would be into the idea of New Age Sword and Sorcery. My take on it, anyway, that is the ethos behind the magazine and the goals of the magazine and all that stuff. Could you please share with those listening, what was it, when I said, hey, you want to do a story for this magazine, that made you think, yeah, we do?
Well, regarding the magazine, sometimes we would sort of look at something new with a bit of skepticism. I think that all of us who write fantasy, we've seen a lot of new magazines rise and fall. So we would, as I say, often be a bit skeptical, but we know you and we know what you're doing with the podcast and with how much enthusiasm you approach the genre, but also clear-sightedness. And we like the proposal that you put together a lot. But I think one of the most important things from our point of view is that you are actively seeking out diverse voices. You're actively including minority authors, and also particularly that you're putting together a structure for a magazine with a Kickstarter so that there is going to be payment. Because one of the problems that so often comes with inclusion is that so often people are told, you're going to be paid an exposure. And it's one thing to say that to authors who are established, but whenever you have authors who already are coming from marginalized backgrounds, then that becomes more of a problem, and it becomes more of a bar to entry and to people getting an opportunity for publication, but also getting their voice heard in a way that puts them on a par with more established authors. And so I think that what you're doing with the magazine is really being the change that you want to see in the world, and doing it in a sincere way and in a meaningful way, rather than it just being sort of new window dressing on the same old ways of doing things.
I don't have anything to add to that. So,
well, thank you. I really, really appreciate that. I right from the beginning, I thought, two things. First of all, I'm glad I've made, dare I say, friends in the Sword and Sorcery writing community that I can invite to work on this, because inviting strangers who are not my fellow white guys to come in and do free writing and be like, oh, the beloved exposure, people die of exposure. We've heard all the catchphrases. Didn't excite me. And because I don't personally know any trans authors, that's, for example, why there aren't any in issue 0 of the magazine. But I have absolutely every plan to rectify that going forward in issues 1 and 2 when I can offer money, because I didn't feel comfortable reaching out to trans strangers and saying, hey, do you want to do something for free? Just to feel like you're being acknowledged. Like, that's not very flattering, I think, to offer that to someone. So, yeah, absolutely. I love this so much. I really enjoyed playing the role of editor and getting to work with talented, lovely people such as yourselves. But as much as I want to do more, oh my goodness, I want to do more, I don't want to do it if I can't pay people, because it just becomes this running gag that I came into interaction with in the independent film scene of, hey, do you want to work for free on my short film? And if you do that, if you work really hard and you're a great guy, or whoever, then you earn the privilege of working on my next short film for free. What? Like, why? I don't know. Maybe it's just about getting older, but I feel like I'm doing things for the sake of doing them is behind me now for the most part. Certainly when it comes to creative stuff involving writing anyways. I mean, I'll go hiking for free, but you know what I mean. So yeah, absolutely. I really, really hope that as many people as possible love issue 0 and we can get people to sign up on the mailing list, prod them when the time comes for the, might be Kickstarter, might be something else. We're still figuring that out right now, but the crowdfunding campaign for issues 1 and 2, where like 95% of the stretch goals are pay bumps for the writers and artists involved. So yeah, I thank you so much for the kind words. I don't know, is there anything else you want to say before we move on to the next challenger?
Well, I would hope for you that there will be a rich benefactor coming out of the woodwork who says, like, here is a very large bag of money, make it so. But yeah, I mean, like, what are the chances of that? Maybe Neil Gaiman from all his newly gotten Sandman money.
Neil, are you out there?
Neil?
Oliver's listening.
Neil, yeah, they're Brandon Sanderson. People joke about him writing the exact opposite of Sword and Sorcery. But you know what? 10 points to that guy for when he got quite a large amount. I believe it was the most successful literary Kickstarter ever that he just did this year, and immediately turned around and used a portion of his funds to back literally every single literary campaign. So, Brandon, if you're out there, you want to get into a New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, baby, I'm here. All right. Well, thanks a lot, you two. And for those who are curious, if we get to do issues 1 and 2, fingers crossed, Remco and Angeline, absolutely, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, you're on board for coming back, yeah?
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, they shall return with a new tale. Will it be their traditional characters, Redman and others? Will it be Bersk having a jolly good time, or something else entirely different? We've yet to find out. All right. On to the next challenger. And with that, we leap back around the world again over to the Philippines to speak with Daryl Quiog, author of Swords of the Four Winds and, far more recently, Track of the Snow Leopard, 5 Tales of Orhan Timur, the Snow Leopard, Furious Swords and Sorcery in a World Inspired by the Ancient East. And lucky you, dear listener, if you haven't already, you can read a brand new original tale of Orhan in issue 0. Alright, let's go talk to Daryl about it. And here we are with Daryl. Hey, man.
Hey, hi, Oliver. How are you?
Doing well. Good to see you. Yeah, and we've braved the time zone difference here. You have just barely started your day, and I am so ready for bed.
I'm ready for second breakfast.
Yeah. And unlike our last interview, my cat has not freshly barfed beside my feet, and technical errors are making me scared to stop. So...
Okay, well, I just ate durian, so let's see if your cat will react to that.
Oh, no. All right. Let's get into our first question. I would like to ask you, someone who so kindly donated an original story for free for use in this magazine, what was the first, image, sentence, just feeling you got, movie you remember that had a cool moment? Like, what was the sort of inspiration that made you go, okay, yeah, I got a story here? And what kind of carried you through from that point to the end?
Okay, 2 things. You already know how much I am into history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how Orhan Timur is basically Genghis Khan dispossessed. So the idea came from, one, the tomb of Genghis Khan that scientists are still looking for up to now, right?
Mm-hmm.
This tomb is actually guarded by a Mongol clan or tribe that is dedicated to that purpose. And they're still there.
Huh.
Believe it or not, they are still there. They don't know where the tomb is exactly, but they are still in those mountains.
Oh, so they're just kind of like in the vicinity, but okay.
Yes, it is their sacred ancestral tradition to live there. So anyway, I had that idea, and then I just had this overpowering image of Orhan struggling through a howling snowstorm, and he should be in his tent, or he should be in a cave somewhere, nice and warm. But he's not, because he's hungry. He's hungry, he's desperate, he's fleeing from his enemies. So I like having my stories begin with that kind of tension laden situation. Really blast it off.
Mm-hmm.
And then he runs into, whoops, I am now in the sacred tomb space of the very first Khan of my tribe. So there we go. So yeah, there's been another idea that has been going through my head, and it's been showing up in the games that I run, in some of my stories. And one of those is that, this old time honored trope of sword and sorcery of robbing the tomb, or robbing the temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
That comes across as rather colonialist.
Yep.
For an Asian. It feeds back into those conquistador fantasies of, going to the temples of India or Mesoamerica and, looting them. So I said, okay, instead of, protesting about what about this, I'll just make a story that goes the other way, right? I'll just make stories that go the other way and show a different way of doing it. And so that dovetailed with the idea of, okay, here is the mythical tomb of the first Khan. And instead of having to take a treasure from it, we have to return a treasure to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that once I had that, then everything started spinning by itself.
I love that. And yeah, to what you said a moment ago too, as well, like that starting where, immediately he's in a rough situation. And I remember when you sent me the early draft, and just the mention of his hunger, something about that just really grabbed me. I guess because it's easy. We can all relate to it, right?
Right.
Most of us aren't getting lost in snowy vistas. But yeah. And then to what you're saying about, I could, moan, or I could create something better. I love that. I really love that. That is so much at the core of what I hope I'm trying to achieve anyway, with the magazine. It's like you can go around scolding people, and sometimes they need it, but by and large, you'll get such better reactions, I think, by creating something like an appealing alternative.
Right. And I think that's what the New Edge is all about, right? I think that's what New Edge is all about. That's what our message is all about. So I hope that made it suit the magazine.
Oh, absolutely. It's just before I hopped on here to do this recording with you, I was chatting over in the New Edge Project channel on the Whetstone Tavern. Shout out again. Do a shot, practically. I mention it so much. And yeah, somebody was showing like a manifesto from like an RPG movement called Dream that had a sub game that was all about like, sword and sorcery in like a more positive light. And like broadly speaking, I was into what it seemed they were doing, but their way of discussing it was very sort of finger waggy and being like, like literally saying, all the sword and sorcery is so problematic, and it's like, no doubt there's issues at hand, right? I mean, that is also, trying to, bring forward the good stuff, leave behind the bad stuff is definitely, part of the whole New Edge thing. But I think when you come out with big, broad statements like that, you got to ask yourself, well, what are my goals? Because if your goals are to bring people in, that's just going to make you sound like you're saying, well, what you like is bad. Or if someone's not familiar with what you're talking about, then they're just going to go, oh, well, that sounds like a lot of work. Why don't I just try something else that doesn't have this baggage or whatever? So yeah, like I much prefer the attitude of saying, let's be thoughtful when we read old stuff, but let's moving forward to create like cool, better things perhaps that build on them, including an alternative, an exciting twist on the Tomb Raider story.
Exactly. Because the surest way to make people close their ears is to scold them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a kid, that's what we all did when we were kids. Somebody scolded us, we closed our ears.
Yeah.
So instead of doing that, let's try to show a better example. Let's try to show an alternative.
Exactly. And so I mean, I feel like we're kind of segueing there anyway. So why don't we go into the second question, which is this? As I mentioned only moments ago, you were very kind and generous in providing an original story for us to use in issue 0 here. You must have felt motivated to do so, perhaps by some of the discussions on the tavern, probably in the tavern about the new Sword and Sorcery deal, perhaps by my approach, which I pitched to you and all the other authors, and perhaps hopes for the magazine. Would you mind telling anyone listening what was it that made you excited about New Age Sword and Sorcery, the ideas, and then also the magazine, expressing them?
Well, yeah, I have to say it's really about the people that were involved. I really liked what was going on. I liked that warm spirit. You get a good vibe. Those discussions really gave me a good vibe. I felt like people knew what they were doing, what they wanted, and I agreed with these things. So, yeah, donating a short is, if it helps to get things off, well, that's a new market for me. That's more inclusivity for the entire Sword and Sorcery sphere. So it's win-win.
I agree. Well, that's awesome, man. You've given me some lovely answers here. Is there anything else you would like to tell listeners or add to what you said before we go?
No, I can't think of anything at this point. What I'm really interested in is hearing Bryn's interview because, I'm sure her story is more or less in the same field. Oh, yeah. One last thing. The Eagle Rocks. It's like, that eagle came out of nowhere, no plans at all, and then all of a sudden, whoops, there he goes.
Yes, I also was a fan of that eagle in the tail. I hope any listeners who've yet to read it will also get a huge kick out of that guy swooping in there.
Yeah, I wonder what Bryn will think of it.
I wish, I'm on the one hand, I'm really happy that, I can say this issue is pulling from across the globe. We've got Australia, the Philippines, we've got a book review from an author up in Japan. We've got authors in Northern Ireland. Of course, we have North Americans. And yeah, I just love that so much. But it does make something very tricky that has come up, which is a couple of the artists really want to meet each other, but they're on completely different continents. And they were like, what if we did a big online launch party? And like, the time zones would be so hard. I don't know. But who knows, eh? Who knows? Oh, well, maybe we'll figure something out so we can all have a brief celebratory hang, perhaps, at some point. Or maybe that's happened already. The magic of podcasts. I don't know if I'll be uploading this right after the magazine goes up or right before. I guess we'll find out. Mm-hmm. In the meanwhile, Daryl, thank you so much for your time and for your creative contributions to the magazine. I really appreciate it.
Hey, welcome, and thank you. Thanks for publishing the story.
Cheers. All right, man. Take care.
All right, cheers. Bye.
Okay, now we're going to loop back around to Southern Ontario, my neck of the world, for a conversation with J.M. Clark, a fantasy writer and social worker who focuses on short stories, novels, and web serials in a variety of subgenres, including, he has a new novel that just came out, actually, called The Mark of the Fool, an quote, epic progression fantasy series. If you don't know what progression fantasy is, don't worry, we get into that. He's also just a really fun guy to chat with and a great presence on, you guessed it, the Whetstone Tavern Discord. All right, how about I let JM talk for himself? Here we go. And here I am with JM Clark. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going?
Well, thank you for joining me on this, I don't even know what day it is anymore. Thursday evening, yes, as we record this segment. This episode's all over.
It's almost as if you've been doing a lot of work lately or something.
Yes, I'm definitely getting what I've described in at least one other interview I've done, not for this thing, I don't think, as having editor brain, because I'm just like multitasking so much even within the magazine, never mind the rest of my life and other projects like this podcast.
Of course.
That my ability to remember who I've told what is shot. Like anecdotes and like details of what's going on. And then we're leaping all over geographically and time zone wise and stuff. And also I'm not recording any of these on the same day. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that would do it. That would do it. I think that would wring anyone's rags out. Just completely.
Yeah, so okay, so let's get into it. So yes, Justin.
Mm-hmm.
I love your story.
Oh, thank you.
It was definitely the story for which I found it easiest to sort of go, I think I know the moment we're going to illustrate.
Oh, yes.
I love it. Listeners, if you haven't seen it, you can actually probably see a cropped version of it on the website banner and actually the full version on the newsletter sign up, which if you're not already on there, get on there, man, because that's how you'll find out about future issues and the crowdfunding and da-da-da-da-da. But yeah, it's great. It's by Morgan, director of Spine of Night King. I think that's his actual legal middle name. But that aside, that came later. What I'd like to ask you about, Justin, if you're down for sharing this with people, is what was the thing that got you first excited, made you go, oh, light bulb moment, I want to tell a story about this, or I think I had a few disparate things, but now this is the element that's bringing it all together, and now I'm really pumped. What was it that got you excited to tell this story?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit. Instead of picking one inspiration, I'm going to pick 3. But I promise I won't go on forever about each of them. So the first thing that sort of came to mind for this story was actually part of another story starring Kiembe of Sengezi. It takes place a little later in his chronicle. And during that, I won't spoil exactly what he says, but he drops a couple of lines that were rather, I won't say disturbing. They were rather surprising to the person he was telling them to. And I thought, expanding on that would probably make for a good story. And at the same time, the second thing that came to me was actually the first line of his introduction, which was, "Death hunted Kiembe of Sengezi across the mountains." And I always really am a big fan of sort of wham lines to begin a story. Just something that makes you ask a question, like, okay, what do you mean by that? That sort of thing. And oftentimes, I can't really even get a story off the ground until that first line hits me. And then things kind of scurry on over from there. And then the final thing, actually, was I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, but there's a character in the story, one of my personal favorites, named Priestess Takat. And in the actual story itself, there's a scene of the two of them standing within a moonlit temple, just the moon beaming in through the skylight, shining on the statue of her goddess. And that was another moment that was like a crystallization. And it was really these 3 moments coming together that made me go, okay, I kind of know where this story can go. Then from there, it was filling in the mists, or rather clearing the mists between the, that were the blanks between. So that's basically how it came to be.
Cool. Now, you mentioned there are other tales. Are there any of them online or in other publications that listeners, if they like this one, they could go find more of it?
Oh, yes. So there's a few places. There's a few places where you can go and check out further adventures. The first would be in the Book of Blades by the Rogues in the House podcast. Well, another great podcast, which I highly recommend. Plug. But that one is called The Curse of Wine, another earlier story for Kiembe. The ones that sort of started it all was a story called The Dreaming Scepter, which is currently published on a website called royalroad.com. It won't be there forever, but the initial version is currently sitting there while it is awaiting publication with my publisher. And that was the very first story written in the Kiembe's Chronicle. And I should say Kiembe and Worry, because this is less of a Conan chronicle and more of a Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser chronicle, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. It's just that in the earlier stories, these people lived lives that were separate before they came together, so I tell the chronicles of what they lived. And this is one of them, The Vapors of Zanai.
Awesome. Is there anything you can tell us, or is it too soon about that publisher and what's happening there?
Oh, well. So there's big things going on with that publisher. First of all, I've got 2 series signed with them. The first one, which is a working title, Oaths, Blood, and Coin, which is the one with the Sword and Sorcery series, starring Kiembe of Sengezi, Worry of Zabiala, and others. And then I also have a rather hefty, some of your listeners might not know what this is, but progression fantasy series coming out with them called Mark of the Fool, which is due out in September 20th. So we've been working together on both series for a while now. And things are coming up to a headway. Editing's done on a few of the books, and audio's done on the first 2 books of the Mark of the Fool series, and we're currently discussing some edits for the Sword and Sorcery one, and things are going well. They've been a dream to work with. They're called Aethon books.
Okay, very cool. Now, you mentioned to me before we started recording here that you have done some voice acting. Are you involved at all with the audio there, or?
I actually haven't done audio for my own fictions or anything, though I did read a chapter for the online audiobook of a web fiction called Worm, which was a superhero web fiction, a very, very dark take on it, but one that was very popular about 10 years ago. So I was lucky enough to do a chapter of its sequel. And then I did some YouTube stuff, which I'm sure would be horrifically embarrassing at this point in time. But at the time, it was a lot of fun. It was an abridged series, which are now really out of vogue. But at the time, it was good fun.
Oh, good. Before we move on to the next question, yeah, I imagine a lot of people don't know what progression fantasy is. It seems monstrously popular, but within a kind of niche. Maybe I'm wrong. I speak as someone who is largely ignorant. If you don't mind, could you sort of share with listeners what, in the short version of what progression fantasy is, and also how you've chosen whether or not to write campaign stories as either progression or sword and sorcery? Because it sounds like he's in both.
Yes, they sort of ride there. There are some commonalities and some contrasts. So the main sort of crux of progression fantasy is that in many sorts of fantasy, there's a thrill that comes from seeing the main character, the protagonist, often growing in skill and power. Not something that you often see in most sword and sorcery. Often it starts off with characters who are at the peak of their power. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are a bit of an exception, along with some others, but for the most part, it's there. But for a lot of the higher fantasy and those sorts of books, they start off with characters earlier in their career. So like when Conan was first storming Venarium, for example, and it chronicles their training and rise to power, essentially. If you remember the Rocky films and their training montages and stuff like that, how it was kind of a thrill to see him like progressing through his training and stuff. That's really what you get from it. The other thing you get is a lot of action. Most of it usually has a fair amount of fights going on, because if you're going to do your homework, you kind of want to show off in the test. So training and then showing off the result, which is where I think it and Sword and Sorcery have some commonalities, because they both focus on that action, that force driving the plot forward. But yes, so that's basically what it is. A fantasy that focuses on a growth in power with the details of how it is done.
Hearing you describe that to me, and it's a very good definition, thank you. I'm realizing I actually have read some progression fantasy way back at the top of this year. I was finishing off, I want to say it was called The Sheep Herder's or Sheep Farmer's Daughter, and it's by Elizabeth Moon. It was from like the late 80s, early 90s. It's all about a young woman who doesn't want to get married to the sheep herder next door or whatever, and so she runs off and joins the like a mercenary company.
Ooh.
And it's very methodical and kind of taking you through like how she joins, what's that's like, how her learning about military culture, training, obviously with quite literal training, and then first experience in battle and so on. And then by the end of the book, it sort of hints at a new path. It's like, okay, she's a pretty good soldier now, but there's like clues that she might take up religion and become a kind of paladin or something. And so
that's awesome.
There's a suggestion of a whole new ladder to climb for another volume. Okay, that's nice to know. I've actually already read something. Okay, and I think that's something that happens a lot with fantasy subgenre. It's like people are like, "What is that? I don't know what that is," and you just kind of tell them, and then they're like, "Oh, I've read a bunch, or at least touched upon it."
Of course,
tends to be what happens. So certainly with Sword and Sorcery, I find.
Oh, absolutely. There's so many people out there that go, "Oh, what's Sword and Sorcery?" And then you go, "Have you heard of The Witcher and Conan?" And they're like, "Oh, I know those." Like, yeah, so many conversations I have like that. Yes.
Anyway, we could talk genre all day long. It happens on the server 24/7, right on the tavern. What is Sword and Sorcery? And to that, let's move on to the other question here, which is New Edge Sword and Sorcery is the name of the magazine. It's also a term that Howard Andrew Jones coined in the 2000s as an attempt to kind of like rebrand Sword and Sorcery and kind of focus on like, I've talked about it a bunch. I'm probably at the top of this episode, and I just haven't recorded that part yet. So you know what it is. The point is, what I'm getting to, taking too long to get here, is when I approached you, we chatted like a little bit on the server, and I think at that point you definitely had seen a lot of the sort of like genteel to rugby match level tone conversations that were being had over the spring of like figuring out, well, what is New Age Sword and Sorcery now? What would it be? What would we do with it? I don't know. Maybe an anthology, maybe a magazine. Oliver, do a magazine. Okay. All that stuff. But you and I didn't really like know each other. So I think it's really cool and really generous of you that, when you responded positively to me pitching to you the idea of contributing a whole new original tale to this inaugural test issue. of a brand new, untested magazine. So surely there must have been something about the idea of the magazine and the ideas the magazine is trying to express that made you up for that. Would you mind telling listeners a little bit about what it is about, the ideas in the magazine proper that made you excited to get in on this New Edge sword and sorcery thing?
Well, I find that with sword and sorcery is a absolutely fantastic and wonderful genre. But often what it suffers from is what I would like to call access. And specifically, people finding characters that they could relate to and accessing those adventures. The sort of adventures that Conan goes on or that Elric of Melnibone goes on and stuff like that. Since the genre is so steeped in long traditions of fantasy, traditions that often were directed toward a certain kind of person, I often thought of, well, how wonderful would it be if different sorts of people could go on these sorts of adventures. I mean, you see with the popularity these days of Dungeons and Dragons, it exploded when the hobby became more open for more people and more kinds of people in different perspectives. New Edge excited me because it was the first time I heard a term applied to a sort of new, sharpened sword and sorcery that would open up access for many different sorts of people. And that's not to disparage the previous work that has been done in the genre. Like, the Sword and Soul movement has been incredible. Mm-hmm. It's already opened a major avenue for new voices, new visions to enter the genre. But I think this opens it up even wider. And a lot of people will look at genre and say, well, what's the point of a new term? And there's an expression that I often hear, which is writers hate subgenres, readers love them, because it's just a shorthand for letting them know, oh, well, this is where I kind of find where I want to read. And for adventures that have the absolute unapologetic spirit of pulp, but opened up for anyone to take those journeys to those wonderful climates and those incredible locations, completely unbound, New Edge is the shorthand for it, just from the discussions that I heard of in the server. And that got me very excited. And the magazine got me excited in particular because I've often been part of different discussions before, and they always end up in the same way. Well, someone should do something. And then that's the end of the conversation. But a magazine, yes, but a magazine really is like a coalescence. It's a place where you can go and read stories that are exactly what New Edge, as per the movement, defined by Howard Andrew Jones, is all about. So that's really what got me excited. I went, oh, someone did something. Well, I want to jump in on that as well.
Cheers. Yeah, I remember when these conversations were happening around late May, but somebody I think had shouted, do an anthology, and I was like, go to hell. That's a lot of work. But then I went to bed and I thought about magazine, and here we are.
You fool.
But at that point, at that point, a little before I said, I said, well, okay, how about a magazine? But just before, I remember thinking, like, yeah, we've started. Me and a few other people, like Kevin Beck, got his hands in particular. I remember throwing around ideas for how to say what New Edge is in a tweet, and how to say what New Edge Sword and Sorcery is in like a paragraph. And then there was this idea of like, oh, and then we'll have one more version. We'll have like a one pager of like a manifesto, which is a dangerous word.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, like, various and sundry characters fly before your eyes when you say that. And after a while, I was like, maybe I'll write that one pager later. Maybe I just want to focus on like making like an expression, because then what do you do with that one page, right? You just make a website and tell people to go read it. And it's gotten to the point now where the closest thing to that is an article that I put at the very end. As of this moment, we're still doing layout, folks, but right now it's right at the very end of issue 0, where I just kind of say, okay, you've read the whole magazine. I hope you've enjoyed it. You've at this point read Howard Andrew Jones with his definition as it originally came about and the story behind that. Here's me, the editor, the guy who's put this, arranged this, all these wonderful efforts by all these wonderful people, such as yourself, Justin. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to tell you what it means to me now that you've had a chance to kind of absorb a bunch of the expressions of what it is. Mm-hmm. I think that's a better order, let people figure it out a bit for themselves and then be like, okay, here's what I'm saying.
Yes. And
that is the closest thing to that one pager I finally ended up writing, because I was like, okay, here it makes sense. Mm-hmm. Here it makes sense to put at the end of an expression of the idea. and then be like, okay, just to clarify, here's how the person steering this particular expression of it feels about it. Because having as you say, it's so important to have an expression because we've all been part of conversations of one kind or another, even whether it's something analogous to the let's open this thing wide open for more people and more. And again, people were doing that before, but it's like, let's put a name around it, right? Like, I hope once the magazine gets out and people get more of an idea of like, oh, this is what this thing is, beyond the few blog posts and interviews that have been up so far, I hope that more people who are already doing this, because I'm not inventing it by any stretch of the imagination, but who are doing this kind of thing, maybe can go, oh, that's a good name. Hey, let's get under that. Let's rally behind. Let's all join together. Let's mutually support each other. Let's lift, all those boats up. That's my hope is that, not that I'm going to be like the savior of lots of writers who want to get in the door but weren't sure about it before, but that I'll just be showing like, here's a positive example. Let's like laterally join up together and let's all make a bigger, better thing together. Like I love seeing it as like as non-hierarchically as possible and like a collaboration.
Which is the way to do it, I think. Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll go on, I'm sure. But I think for now, we're hitting 20 minutes, and I said 15, gosh darn it, for each person. So, unless there's anything else you want to share about, the magazine and stuff in general, or?
Well, no, it's just that it's been an absolute wonder to be part of this. And I'm looking forward to passing out copies when it comes out. Absolutely.
Yeah, me too. I got excited. I was at my favorite secondhand bookstore, Sellers and Newell in Toronto, College Street.
Ooh.
And I was talking to the owner and I was mentioning that, I'll do the magazine before I even got the chance to ask or say anything. He was like, oh, give me some copies to put in the window. And I was like, yeah, it just feels nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah.
All right, my fellow Canadian, and the only person practically who wasn't in another time zone, thank you for being considerate by being in Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure you and I will be talking more soon.
Absolutely. Enjoy the other interviews.
All right. Good night.
See ya.
And with that, we are staying in roughly the same time zone, but only roughly. We're actually hopping back 1 hour to, I don't know, is it mountain time? Whatever you call it when someone lives near Chicago. Which is the case with our next guest, sword and sorcery veteran, David C. Smith. He got his career started during the second wave of sword and sorcery, and I was so excited that he wanted to take part in what I hope will contribute to a third wave happening. He is the author of 28 novels and numerous short stories, many of them part of his ongoing Atlaman cycle, which features his sword and sorcery protagonist, Auron. He also wrote with Richard L. Turney many Red Sonja fantasy novels, and he won the 2018 Atlantean Award from the Robert E. Howard Foundation for Outstanding Achievement book category for Robert E. Howard, A Literary Biography. He also wrote one of my favorite reads this year, the sword and sorcery novel Sometime Lofty Towers, which I can't recommend enough. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm quite fond of David, and I think you will be too if you haven't already gotten to know him after you listen to this little mini interview. And here we are with David. Hi, David.
Hi, Oliver. How are you?
Doing well, and very happy to see your face again. Last time we sat down for an hour that became 2 hours before editing.
It became 2 hours. I remember that. Yeah, my family complained that I talk too much, so when I have the chance, clearly I talk too much. So.
Well, I mean, me too, right? So that's a dangerous combination. Let's. I was telling people, time limit of about 15 minutes. Let's see what happens, though.
Yeah, that's fine. Here we go. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Please share with listeners what it was that whether it was an image, a sentence, remembering an old movie you love, whatever it was that sort of first really inspired you, made you go, okay, yeah, I think I got a story here, and some of the stuff that like carried you through. What made you excited?
Oh boy, that's really not too hard to answer. I've been writing sword and sorcery fiction for a long time, and as much as I like the old school stuff, with like the lone gunslinger, the lone sword swinger going through their paces in these stories, you can get a variety of things you can do with that. You can do it because it's like a detective story or Western. You can go in a lot of directions with it. But at some point, I was like bumping up against what further directions can we take this? One of them might be to go in the direction of different cultures and things like that, which would be fun to do. I would want to tread carefully because I'm just an old white guy from Ohio. And I want to be respectful of situations like that, even if I make up the culture or whatever.
Well, as we talked about in your interview, I thought you had a very good approach to how you handled that in Sometime Lofty Towers.
Yeah, thank you. No, do the research, talk to folks, who were there. Yeah, no, that was my idea. So I did that with the novel Sometime Lofty Towers. but we're living in such interesting times.
Mm.
Those of us who are aware are pushing borders in so many directions in terms of culture and gender. There's lots of room there to move in whatever kind of genre you like to write in. So why not sword and sorcery?
Mm.
So I had written a couple of stories where it was a woman who was a little older woman who was a witch, and the younger guy was a young swordsman. It's fun to put two characters together and watch the sparks fly or the conversation happen, to see how their characters develop. They're both straight, which is not a problem. I mean, I wrote 6 Red Sonja novels,
Mm.
and she was cisgendered. But that's an area that I've only approached once before in a big fantasy trilogy that I wrote. So I thought I like the idea of having this couple who are there for each other.
Mm.
They're best buddies or whatever, like cops on the beat. But she's gay and he's gay.
Yeah.
And so what's the big deal? Well, it's not a big deal. She's
Well,
gay.
yeah, it's not a
gay.
problem, but it's nice to see.
Yes, it is. So, it makes them inclusive, and it doesn't make them, extraordinary or stand out like they're shining light in the darkness or anything. They're folks.
Mm-hmm.
I've been fortunate in my life that I've known, God, any number of gay people as friends, as co-workers, as acquaintances. So it wasn't a hard reach, to just get it settled in my mind. How am I going to do this? And then you just do it. And it was, as I say, it wasn't a hard reach.
Mm.
It was just presenting them matter-of-factly, the way that we do with characters that we want to follow and learn about. So they're very matter-of-factly, and they've obviously been around for a while for each other and everything. And then you throw them into a situation that either tests that or strengthens their bond, something like that. So that became the story. The actual, fantastic elements of the story are, will not surprise anyone who's read a lot of sword and sorcery. So that, we're in our comfort zone in that.
Well,
in
there
that
was one
respect.
point. I won't spoil
Yeah.
anything because we got to
No,
assume
please
people
don't.
haven't necessarily read it. But there was definitely
Please, yeah.
at least one surprise involving some literature you maybe remember. Well, we'll talk about it later. But I remember
Yeah.
there was a moment that made me kind of pull my head back and go, "Whoa, I didn't see that coming."
Oh, good. I did my job. Good.
Absolutely. and to what you were saying a moment ago, yeah, absolutely. The two characters, like, it's interesting to have it be sort of the opposite of how people like to set up male and female duos of like, maybe there's going to be some sexual tension. Will they, won't they? And it's like, no. Right. They won't.
No, they
but
won't.
That's okay because then we can think about other stuff. And neither of them, is their sexuality the first, second, or even third thing that I was thinking about while I was reading the story. But it informs who they are, and it presents a fun dynamic where, one was trying to set the other one up at the bar, like as a friendly thing,
Mm-hmm.
And it all just kind of plays a bit differently, So, yeah, it's. I thought you handled that aspect very well.
Thank you. Yeah.
I don't recall having any notes on it,
Yeah, thank you. And it is a different aspect, and that what makes them interesting characters is that there's not that romantic or sexual tension between them, which we've seen a lot of that, and that's fun. But with these two, it's a different dynamic.
Well, yeah, in a way, it kind of. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just got to say, I really like them. I ended up really liking these characters.
Well, I'm glad because, it's no secret. You're welcome back. I would love to read another story with this duo because there's a lot going on with them. And, as you were saying, like, part of what's kind of interesting about taking sexual tension, like, firmly off the table is it then leaves you to ask, okay, well, what else is going on?
Right.
What is going to be points of contention with these two?
Right.
And without spoiling anything, like, in the story, I liked how you explored issues of trust. Like, they obviously trust each other with their lives, but, not telling everything to each other. And that comes through in the story in a way that I found very entertaining and also kind of interesting of what it suggested. Like, they're there for each other, but, let's see how that plays out.
Right. See, and that's the kind of stuff that gives me ideas for a future story. If I start with that, with their relationship, and, anybody who's grown to adulthood, knows how wacky and strange some relationships can be, and some of them are wonderful. But it'd be interesting to see them go through some of that. I'd like to write more about them. I like them,
Oh, cool. Well, fingers crossed that lots of people love the magazine. Lots of people get copies for friends and sign up for the mailing list. Listener, I'm giving you the hard sell here.
Yeah, no, I hope people like them.
Yeah, I hope we get to successfully crowdfund issues 1 and 2 and get another story and get some more art with them.
Good.
That was fun too, eh? I'm really proud that we got individual illustrations for everybody's stories, original works.
Yeah.
Yours by Simon Underwood there. Yeah.
Yeah, I like what he did.
Yeah, okay. So, all right. Well, I feel like we discussed the story pretty well for now. I mean, you and I could always go longer. We know this, but
Yeah.
Now, David, you and I had the good fortune to, if I can be so bold, say, got along well in our long interview.
Certainly think so, yes. I think so indeed.
So I wasn't some like completely random weirdo when I approached you, but
Uh-huh.
nonetheless, I was a guy you had just met.
Yeah.
And all us writers have had a lot of experience with being asked to do something for exposure. Oh, it'll be great. It'll get you out there. People die of exposure, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was very grateful, even just on that premise. Never mind the fact that I was getting someone with your experience on board, which is very gratifying. I was just some guy, and I was like, "Hey, do you want to do a story for a new magazine? Issue 0, the test issue."
Yeah.
And you were down. So I'm curious. Aside from maybe us getting along on the interview there, what was it, because I think you're not heavily active on the Whetstone Tavern, but I think you saw at least some of the discussions around New Edge Sword and Sorcery, the sort of ideas that were getting chucked around. And of course, you and I talked about it a bit. What was it about sort of, New Edge Sword and Sorcery, the idea, and the magazine that's expressing that idea that got you excited?
I think the idea that it's new, if I were involved in it in my little corner, of telling a story, I could push against the barriers a little bit, kick a few bricks out of the wall. To be there on the ground floor at the very beginning is very tempting too. I like the idea. I like this idea of the new edge, of expanding sword and sorcery, because this is kind of like my genre. I've written more in this genre than probably anything else that I've written. I like it very much, and I feel strongly that we can go in many directions with different characters in it. And, maybe I can really assist in some way to get this thing going. I like that idea. How else shall I put it? I guess I want to say I've always been on the side of the underdog. I don't see the magazine as being an underdog. But
it's brand new.
I guess maybe in a way, this is the first time people are really doing stuff like this. It's going to help define the new edge.
Yeah.
And I know people have been kicking around the edges of it for a while. I'm sure I have in a way,
I have said I think it kind of covers in some ways stuff that a lot of people have been nibbling at from their own corners, but I think it's handy to kind of throw up a banner. Yeah, I'm talking more about the idea in the magazine here, but the magazine expresses that idea. I think it's handy to throw up kind of a banner and be like, hey, why don't we kind of all like get under this banner, or those who want to, it's optional obviously,
right?
And kind of like collaborate and help each other out, and rising tide lifts all ships and all that good stuff. I feel like there's a lot of stuff I see where a lot of authors who are maybe all working in the same genre and all have similar desires for like where they'd like to see it go, are all kind of, they're all off in their own little corners on their own, or there were a couple of them are talking, but not all of them are talking. And even simple things like figuring out how to better promote yourself online. I watch people each individually reinventing those wheels, rather than perhaps sharing results with each other. I was just talking to Kevin Beckett, who has been our marvelous social media volunteer running our Instagram and our Twitter. And we were just talking the other day, he was telling me some interesting developments and what he's been learning while doing that. And I said, hey, this feels like my podcast sense is going, why don't you take notes? And then eventually when we're far enough down the line to make it interesting, why don't we do an episode talking about everything you've learned on that, so that other authors in general, but I guess I'm thinking sword and sorcery authors, can learn from that and save them having to repeat all the experiments and so on. And he was like, oh yeah, I'm already taking notes. This is great.
Okay.
So I just thought like, oh, wonderful. There's so many different aspects of this, and like the inclusion thing gets a lot of discussion, and I'm glad, because that's important. But I don't like the idea of it necessarily eclipsing everything else, such as sharing knowledge, lifting each other up. And you were talking about, pushing the boundaries. There's all kinds of ways to do that. And I got to say, David, I really hope we get to do that other story with you, another story with you for many reasons. But one of them is so that I can further highlight and underline with you and all the authors I hope to work with again, and new ones I want to bring in. It'll be a time to really do the things you've always wanted to do. Any idea that you think is like too wild, like, let's talk about it.
That's a good way to put it. It kind of reminds me of a couple of things. Back in the day, I was too young to really pay much attention at the time, but when Harlan Ellison did Dangerous Visions and put the word out to all these authors, what's the story you've written that nobody would publish? Because it was too avant-garde, or it pushed boundaries in some way, whatever it might be. You got a couple of good anthologies out of that, so you're working with bright, talented people who want to do interesting stuff. Shoot, turn them loose.
Yeah, because I'm so, as you and I speak on August 29th, 2022, I am both extremely proud of what is currently at roughly the 90% mark for the issue. We're getting
Mhm.
close. I'm optimistic. Hopefully I won't be setting myself up to look like a fool when I say I think we'll make our goal of releasing, somewhere in September, hopefully around the middle. I'm so proud of what I can already see.
Good.
And yet at the same time, of course, I'm already starting to be at that place where I'm thinking about what I've learned and what I could do differently going forward to build on this. And I'm so excited to get to that. And definitely a big part of it is going to be working with the authors on those ideas, on those dangerous visions, finding where that takes us while still being recognizable as sword and sorcery. Because, this is one of my things. I bang the drum a lot, but I think when you even think about literally a sword, right?
Yeah.
What is a stronger sword? One that is rigid and inflexible, or one like a extremely well-crafted katana or something that can bend fantastically, right?
Yeah.
I just think the sword sorcery can be, and certainly its greatest strength, I would argue, is its amazing flexibility, because it's almost like you can kind of set out these sort of posts like a big wild wrestling ring, with okay, outsider protagonists over here, Lovecraftian kind of horror over here, personal motivations rather than heroic necessarily over here. And you have those posts and they kind of mark boundaries. But what runs between those posts, if we're talking about a wrestling ring? Super elastic rope that you can just like push all the way out and jump off and do wild moves. I love it. I love it, and I hope we can all have fun bending that rope a lot to further issues.
One of the things I'm working on now, and it's taken me forever. Bob McLean at Pulp Hero Press, he no longer publishes fiction, and that makes us all very sad because he published a lot of stuff that I wrote that was kind of off the beaten track, and I couldn't find agents for some of this stuff. And he published it, it's good work, but it just didn't quite fit the mainstream. But one of the things he suggested was a book on writing sword and sorcery fiction.
Right.
And he asked me if I'd be interested in doing that. I might have mentioned this before.
Yeah, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't been talking about it a lot because I don't want to drop it as a surprise or anything, but it's building slowly because I'm doing a lot of reading and then commenting on stories that I like and why I like them. But it basically starts out with what sword and sorcery fiction is and what it isn't. It isn't, for instance, heroic fantasy fiction. It's a different little set of values there that are in there. So I talk about what it is and kind of like where it came from. There's a brief introduction. We go back to Howard and I briefly fill in all that stuff. But the main part of the book is that I'm reading fiction written by a lot of writers today. Seth Lindbergh and Joe Bonadonna and Skylar Hernstrom and all these people. I'm reading their fiction and I'm using them as examples for this is really good. Look at this writing, see how good it is for this reason or for that reason. The different elements that go into building the story. The very beginning, when I introduce everything, this sounds a little pretentious or pretentious, but the opening line is, "This is the oldest story that we have. There is a force, and we must confront it. And it could be a giant bear in the cave. It could be an angry god sending a flood. It could be your spouse when he or she is pissed off. It could be, the gangsters running the town. It could be anything, but there's something going on and we have to deal with it. And when we, in our kind of fiction, personify that as a sorcerer or something demonic or something ageless or whatever, now we're getting into the realm where it's touching bone and it's touching nerve and it can feel archaic and very honest and kind of primitive, and we know it in our bones, what's going on. So when it's done right, that's what we get with sword and sorcery. We can layer it however we want. It can be lighthearted, it can be, whatever direction you want. But the core of it is that thing right there, which can be kind of horrifying. Some of the best stories, it wakes you up and it becomes existential. It's like, oh God, I looked into the abyss, now what? It looked back,
No, absolutely. I think of probably my favorite Conan story, People of the Black Circle, and you have that scene where the master is trying to break down Devi Yasmina by essentially hurtling her back through the entire history of womankind.
Yeah.
And like what a wild attack on her ego, and dark magic and all that stuff, to the bone, as you say.
Exactly. I actually quoted that. So I don't know if I wrote this book a few years ago called Robert E. Howard, A Literary Biography.
Okay.
And I went through his work, like one writer looking over the shoulder of another writer, kind of like review what he did and how he did it and why it's so good. And I quoted that scene because it's so powerful. And he would do stuff like that, not infrequently. And it gets right down. He was a master of that. I think he went there in his dreams or something. Yeah, he'd go back and go right down to the bone there. So yeah.
Oh, marvelous. Well, we're doing it again. It's 24 minutes.
I'm sorry.
I want to be fair to.
I
No, I'm
apologize.
sorry. Like I knew it would happen. That's why I set it up at the beginning. It's all good, but I want to be fair to the other writers.
Well,
we'll get on to them. But
you can cut some of me out. I know editors love to cut out my stuff. So go ahead.
maybe a little bit. It was all very interesting, and that's the problem,
sure.
right? It's not if you were just waffling, I'd be like, I'll cut out a bunch of this. But everything you have to say, David, I find very interesting, and lots of other people do too. So, are we lucky to have you in the magazine? All right, man. I'm going to move on now, but thank you so much for your time and for your story.
Appreciate it. Okay, no, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it, and I sincerely mean that. I really do. So,
I appreciate it, man. All right, take care.
Good luck, man.
Oh man, did you hear the part where I was like, maybe mid-September? Hilarious. In case you don't know, the magazine came out on precisely the final day of the month. And even then, it probably would have been more like October 1st or 2nd or something, if not for the heroic last-minute efforts of our proofreader, Jordan Douglas Smith. Thank you so much, Jordan. And this wasn't because anybody was being lazy or clownish. Far from it. I continued, now it's been about 4 days when I'm saying this, 4 days since it came out. I'm so impressed by the work everybody put in. And frankly, I even impressed myself a little bit. I was kind of surprised at what I was able to do when I really had to do it. But before I get too choked up at my own bravery, let's remember this is about talking to the authors of the magazine, and the behind the scenes is next time. So without further ado, I would like to get to our final mini interview, this one with author TK Rex. We're rotating the globe a little further over to the West Coast as TK Rex writes science fiction and fantasy in San Francisco. Recently, she attended the Clarion Writers Workshop in San Diego and has had short fiction published in Strange Horizons, The Molotov Cocktail, and Luna Station Quarterly. She is also the only person I reached out to who I didn't already know from the Whetstone Tavern Discord or interviewing them on this podcast. All right, let's hear what she has to say. And here I am with Taya. Hello.
Hi.
Nice to have you here. Thanks for joining me. You are fitting somewhere in the daisy chain of authors we're enjoying today. I think number 5. Who knows? Future Oliver can sort that out. It's his problem. I like giving him things to deal with. Okay, so I loved your story. And of course, I am hoping and feeling strongly that others may love it too, hence it putting it in the magazine. Could you tell listeners, under the assumption they have not yet read it, what it was that kind of got you like thinking, okay, this is the thing? Like, what was the image? What was the theme? What was the starting point that made you go, yeah, I got a story here? And maybe, some other stuff that kind of carried you through to the end of writing it.
Okay, so this story was a bunch of different things coming together into one thing. So I would say like the first kernel of it was actually when you reached out to me on Twitter and were like, would you want to write another sword and sorcery story? Because I'd never written sword and sorcery before I wrote the one that you read in Queer Blades, my favorite shape of all. And that was like my first sword and sorcery story, and it was a total experiment for me, and it was outside my comfort zone. So I never really like thought that hard about writing any more of it until you messaged me. I totally want to do this, but I don't know what it's going to be yet. But I was like at Clarion, I think, when you messaged me with the writers workshop in San Diego. And so I figured one of my stories while I was at Clarion was going to be the sword and sorcery story for you. And so I think it was like week 4. I must have written it in week. I think I wrote most of it in week 3. And then I finished it for week 5. And our instructor that week was Ted Chang, which is a really interesting combination to have like Ted Chang critiquing my weird ecology sword and sorcery story.
Yeah, for those who aren't familiar, could you tell us a brief blurb of why that's amazing? Why Tai Chang is an oddball match?
So Ted Chang writes, he's known as a writer of science fiction short stories. So he wrote the short story that the film Arrival was based on. So very sci-fi. And I love sci-fi. I write sci-fi too. That's kind of my like main dig is sci-fi. he tends to write like very meticulously crafted, very clever, intelligent science fiction short stories that are like widely regarded as just sort of brilliant. And then I came in here with like a unicorn. But yeah, it was really interesting because some of his feedback was like, well, this seems like it's trying to do science stuff in a genre that's not really known for science stuff. So what's with that? And part for me, the thing that I think was, this also gets to like the other question about New Age. For me, like the interesting part of writing in the genre this time around was kind of pushing those boundaries and seeing if I could get away with writing a secretly science fiction story wrapped up in sword and sorcery, and gives you a little bit of like science communication in there if I can get away with it. It's fun and like genre-y. And one of the things that he and I talked about around this story in particular, because one of the things he brought up was like, you mentioned this word ecosystem, and you don't really see words like that in sword and sorcery because they didn't even exist really in the popular lexicon until like the 60s, and it's very much like a scientific term. And one of my other classmates, Matt Olivas, brought up the excellent point that like even though the word wasn't coined until the 1960s, the concept of ecology is inherently an indigenous concept. It goes all the way back as long as we've had language. Basically, we've understood ecology, and so I went ahead and I think kept the word in there. And that was a big part of the inspiration. The other parts of it were that I was in San Diego at the time I wrote it at the Clarion UCSD workshop. And so this is the one story from my time there that actually takes place there as well, because the whole landscape, he's going from, over the course of the story, he goes from like the beach that was actually like Black's Beach down the cliffs just outside of the campus, and then up the cliffs, and then through what would have been there before the campus was there. And then there's actually a eucalyptus grove on campus. And so I did a lot of my writing in that eucalyptus grove because it was just very peaceful. Despite being like a monoculture of invasive species, it was a very peaceful place to write. So it was a big inspiration. And then, of course, the last two pieces are The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, which I flipped through the opening of. It's one of my favorite books of all time to get like some inspiration for tone. And the song that a friend of my mom's, there's a band called Phoenix. It was like the 80s. They were friends with my mom, and she had this album and she played it all the time when I was growing up. And it's this kind of like rock anthem called The Black Unicorn. Under the artist's name at the time was Heather Alexander. They've had a change of name since then, but it's a great song. Like a bunch
you linked me to it. I really dug it.
Yeah, that was a lot. That was a lot. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. No, I always like to get more insight on why people write their stories. Whenever I read a book and there's maybe like a interview with the author or essay kind of thing at the back, being like, where did all this come from? I'm delighted. It's one of the 105 reasons I like Vonnegut, because he always opens his books with his little essays being like, anyway, here's where all this bullshit came from. Enjoy my doodle of an asshole that I did with a marker. Yeah. I always love to know more.
Love it.
Yeah. No, it's funny. You and I were talking about this just before I hit record, and it's a big part of the genre. Anyone who's already into it knows this. There's an essay on it by Brian Murphy in the issue, and Bryn Hammond, I thought, spoke to it beautifully in her answer to my questions in this whole mishmash interview stitched together I'm doing of the outsider in Sword and Sorcery. And you are the outsider. And I always imagine like fishmen calling it out from the old Innsmouth tale, in this issue. But I gotta say, it was a bit of a science experiment. I wasn't sure how it would go. As you may recall, I was sort of possibly too much because I was feeling a little nervous, when I spoke to you on the phone when we were doing developmental edits. I was like, if you want to pull the ripcord, run away screaming, go for it. I don't want to bully you. I don't want to, smother your voice as an author and like destroy your themes and what you're trying to do, just trying to like shove in some swords or whatever. But I think I really enjoyed that process. I hope you did too, where we worked together to try and find a way to preserve your narrative as I feel we did, preserve your voice as I feel we did, but kind of guide the story to be kind of more in the mold of the kind of weird mythic edge of sword and sorcery, you know? And I really like the results. I hope you do too.
Yeah.
What am I doing here? I'm like looking for reassurance. Like, tell me I'm pretty. But but I don't know. I'm just thinking it through the whole thing. So we navigate from your inspiration, which, before we get to the second question, it was very funny with the whole environmental angle. And you emailed me early on being like, okay, here's my first draft. It's got, like, I believe you said, hefty environmental content. I hope you're okay with that. And if, like, my life was a TV show that was, like, sort of ham-fisted in its symbolism, it would have just, like, smash cut to the framed piece of newspaper, because I'm an only child listener, so this happens. My mother has on the wall in our spare room at my house where I grew up in, of a piece of newspaper of, like, 7-year-old Oliver making the local news because I bullied my dad into helping me pick up all the recycling from my street and bring it to the nearest depot because I was too impatient to wait for amalgamation of my small village into the bigger nearby city to bring us recycling services. So that just sets the tone to give you an idea when you were like, hefty environmental content, is that okay? And I was like, yeah, it's pretty good. It's okay. I'm aligned with that. Okay, so yeah, lovely. Thank you for giving some more insight on the inspiration thing. Oh, and one other thing before I move on. You gave away this publicly on Twitter, so I think it's kosher to mention that I didn't know this until, like, we'd already gone to the point of the draft being approved, but apparently there's, like, a Marvel Cinematic Universe thing going on here with co-authored by you and your mother, something like that.
Oh yeah, so that was the other. There were a lot of things that came. There were a lot of threads that came into the story. That was the one I somehow left out. Yeah, absolutely. This is like the most important thing. So it actually, I mentioned my favorite shape of all, which is a story I had in the Queer Blades anthology. And that one actually takes place in this. I wrote them in the same universe. I was just like, I have a sword and sorcery universe already. We'll just use them. And those are the two now that are sword and sorcery in that universe, and they both take place about 1,000 years in the past of the rest of the stories. And the rest of the stories are more like, I guess, high fantasy. They're not really high fantasy. They're definitely secondary world fantasy. Mm-hmm. The world is very closely based on California, since that's where I live, and my mom lives over in Berkeley, and we're co-writing these together. So the first story that was published and that I wrote in this series was my story Gentle Dragonfires, which was in Strange Horizons in January, I think. And I was writing that story, and at a certain point I was like, I should get more specific on the ritual and the song that's in this story. And my mom is over here, literally a poet and the founder of the Society for Ritual Arts. And so I was like, I should get my mom in this. And so she, like, loved it and helped me finish that story. And so we published it together. And she was like, I want to write in this world too. It's so cool. And I was like, awesome, we should write in it together. And now we have, like, apparently she just counted 19 stories all set in this world at different time periods. And definitely going to be a collection. A lot of these stories are not finished yet, but we are
with 19, I imagine it's gonna, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. It's all based on this common setting, which we call, like, the Faultlands, and it is essentially mostly Northern California. This one is, of course, Southern California, but it's not California. It's just, like, very, very inspired by California. We always have this kind of thought of, like, why is all this fantasy defaulting to, like, this generic European setting when, like, we've never even really, I've been to Paris, like, once. Like, I don't even know Europe. Let's write a fantasy story where we live. And so it also centers around, the bulk of our stories in that world center around more like a gold rush era, where the big themes are, like, ecological change and dealing with a environmental crisis that's a much more like what we have today in California in the modern era.
Cool. Well, I look forward to being able to read more of those stories. And listener, in case you're curious, that Queer Blades tale, Queer Blades is available for free, the first issue of the anthology. So if you want to go check that out, just give it a Google. It's what made me reach out. So, I obviously endorse the story. Yeah, okay. So let's move on to the other question, which maybe, I think, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say, because everyone else in the magazine is essentially started off already as, like, a sword and sorcery, like, head. Like, they knew the genre. They had all written stories in it. And I think not David as much, but certainly the other authors had all had a presence at one point or another on the Whetstone Discord Tavern, where the, like, thunderous discourse erupted back in the spring that led to the reemergence of the term, and ultimately me deciding to do this magazine. So they all had like the backstory essentially. And then I reached out to you and was like, hey, there's this thing. It's called Sword and Sorcery. You've only done one story and it was kind of more high fantasy, but I think if you want to work with me, we can treat this like a cool writing exercise. Anyway, I'm building on that tradition. There's a whole new thing on top of it. Like, here's some more stuff you got to learn. Which, again, you can tell I'm making fun of myself because it felt a little outrageous, but I also felt it was worth doing. What was it? Because it was very kind of you to agree and be like, yeah, okay, I'll take a chance on you, guy I don't know. Like, I also had prior relationships with all the other authors to one degree or another. Guy I don't know for a magazine that's brand new in genre I'm not super familiar with, that's unpaid, frankly. Like, so I thought that was very, very cool of you, and I would love to know what it was. And say this for the listener, not for my ego. What was it about New Edge Sword and Sorcery as I explained it to you, and New Edge Sword and Sorcery, the magazine, that made you go, yeah, okay, yeah, this sounds good. I want to do this.
Yeah. So, well, firstly, it just was like really happy timing that I was at a writing workshop. So I was like, yeah, why not? Like, this could be this is a great starting point, as good as any, right? So that was really convenient. The other thing, though, was that like I did have a lot of fun writing that other story, My Favorite Shape of All, and I thought this one might be fun too. And it was, although in some ways it's a much shorter story. This one's a much shorter story, but it in some ways harder. But it was a lot of fun. And I like what you were saying about just kind of wanting to push the boundaries of the genre a little bit and like modernize it a little bit and make it more inclusive. I think for me, like, being inclusive is probably the biggest thing. I mean, just as a general principle, I mean, my story is like about the importance of diversity in a lot of ways. And I write about that a lot. And I think about that a lot too. As like a evolutionary biology nerd, like it's just this whole running theme through like every level of like, I enjoy having diverse friends, you know, like
Yeah.
just like general, and I feel like it's very important for keeping the genre fresh and interesting and including people and giving people a place to tell their versions of these stories. And so often you find that there's genres that, like, I don't know, you hear things around the internet that like, oh, well, that genre is so played and old and boring. But then when like a new group comes into it and makes it their own, it becomes interesting again. So it's good for the genre, it's good for everybody, and it's good for us to like be able to hear diverse new perspectives and takes on the classics and whole new ideas within these things. I love the iteration of it. The whole reason I love speculative fiction is because I just am really curious and want like different new cool takes on stuff. And my favorite thing is when you get like a scenario in speculative fiction, science fiction or fantasy that like is just so poignant, or like an emotion that like you would not find anywhere else. Like you can have these kinds of like scenarios where it's like, wow, I just never thought there was a very specific emotion for that thing that could never exist in real life, you know? And that's like one of my favorite things about the genre.
Awesome. And I mean, what a wonderful answer. I really hope that, people love issue 0 and we get to crowdfund issue 1 and 2 and bring you back. And maybe we can see, if we can try and find that sweet spot of evoking something new in listeners, in readers. I'm in podcast mode. Yeah, I would really love that. Okay, well, I mean, I think at some point we're gonna have you back on the podcast to do a full-fledged interview. I feel like that'd be pretty fun. But
Yeah.
alas, I've got to keep the time limit tight so we can stitch together all these little mini interviews. So yeah, is there anything else you want to say just before we hop off, or is this feeling pretty good to you?
Yeah, I think we've covered everything pretty much. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure working on this story with you, and I'm really psyched to have it be something that people can see really soon. So thanks.
Awesome. All right, well, thanks, Taya, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.
Okay, bye.
All right, and there you have it, folks. All of the authors of all of the original tales in New Edge Sword and Sorcery Magazine, issue 0, out now. Links in the show notes, also on the front page of newedgeswordandsorcery.com. Also, you can search for it on Amazon.com or .ca. Any of the Amazon sites around the world should have it for the softcover and hardcover, yes, hardcover editions of the magazine. The EPUB/PDF is free, which Amazon won't let you do, so that's on payhip.com. But yeah, like I said, you can find that link pretty easy through the show notes of the website. But yeah, free electronically. All right, please join me next episode in 1 week, maybe 2, we'll find out. But join me next episode for the behind the scenes on how the magazine came to be, including like why did I do the magazine, how does it relate to the podcast and the novel, don't worry, that hasn't been forgotten, what were some of the nuts and bolts of making it, and what are the plans for the future. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing, that's @so_writing. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, and PayPal. Thanks for hanging out with me and all these lovely writers, and I'll see you soon.